Because when Jesus came along and he said, if there is lust in your heart, then you have committed adultery.
Yeah, he kind of intensified the law.
He didn't make it easier.
He didn't push it down. He elevated it.
Loving the Lord your God with all of your being is not easier. It's the hardest thing there is to do. Well, we're definitely in a sense, humanity's always living in a state of exile in this world.
Amen.
Apart from God, and even though we know God, it's only we only see Him and know Him in part, or it's everything's just so corrupted. There's so much static here in this world. But the thing that God did, what makes God's people His people, is that He called them out of that. He ultimately then He made a promise to them to make them a great nation, and then they ended up in bondage and slavery in Egypt, and then He delivered them with a mighty display of His strength and His glory and power in the Exodus, and then He took them to the mountain of God and gave them His instruction, the law, and that would be then what. In part, they're His people because He promised them, and that it's getting into our different covenant relationships with God. But He gave them a law that would make them a nation, because a nation is a nation because they're a people with an identity and a law and boundaries and all those kinds of things. But He instructed them, when you enter the land that I'm going to give you, in the land the place where I'm going to put my name and dwell there with you, then you're going to be known as my people, and you'll do that. You'll carry that out. You'll establish yourselves and your generations in that by teaching the children everything I've commanded you. And that's not passively. It says when they wake up and when they go to bed, and on the door and by the gate, and when you go in and when you go out. And it's just all the time.
So it seems that we're very impressionable, and we need to have these things before us often.
Yes.
So if we're just in church 2 hours on Sunday and an hour on Wednesday and fed by the world 7 days a week, other than that, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, He called them out of the world and separated them and commanded them. Part of the law, part of what's emphasized is do not marry and intermingle with those people who are not my people, because they're godless. They worship other gods. And it's not just, just kind of a neutral distinction. No, those other people worshiped other gods that would call them to do horrible, atrocious things that were contrary to the nature and to the virtues of the true God, the character of Yahweh. And so He's calling them out and separating them and putting these boundaries in place for their future generations, so that they could become sanctified or renewed in the image of God. And so in that sanctification, they would be a blessing to the surrounding nations. Right? They would be a blessing to the surrounding nations, because if they failed to live according to Yahweh, what hope do the surrounding nations have left? What are they to look to? Right? Now they're to look to the cross, but then they were to look to the nation of Israel and the blessing that was upon them, so that they too could go, man, they seem to have something that we don't. And that's because they were God's people. That's because God is there. But God's promise to be with them and dwell with them under that covenant was conditional upon their obedience to the law. And so as long as you are faithfully following God, then His promise is to be with you, cause you to prosper, and those surrounding nations would see the blessedness upon you from God, and then they too would be drawn in to worship the true God. But if he clearly makes the distinction, if you reject me, if you go back to the ways of old, your old ways, the ways of the nations surrounding you, the ways of Egypt, where you came from, then I'll forsake you. And not only forsake you, it'll be worse for you. There'll be curses upon you.
That just doesn't sound loving, Dusty.
Oh, but what's interesting, just in the context of this conversation, I was been reading through Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy 28 is laying out some specific blessing. It begins to lay out specific blessings and cursings, and there's a list there of curses that will come upon the people, and many of them are sexual in orientation. And it's interesting to read because it's telling you that it's telling them that they're not to lay with their sister. Don't have sex with your father's wife. Don't have sex with your father's children or your mother's children, your siblings. Don't have sex with your mother-in-law. Don't have sex with an animal. Now, why is God saying all this? Why is He giving all those instructions to them? Because that sounds crazy. In our mind, I mean, that's pretty extreme. We'd probably all together, homosexuals included, LGBTQ community, would look upon those things and consider them abhorrent. Might even call them an abomination. To have sex with an animal, I mean, that's insulting to...
Or your mother-in-law.
Yeah, I mean, and to equate our sexual behavior with something like that, come on, that's insulting, man. But why was God instructing them in that? Because that's who they were. That's who the people around them were. That's the kind of life they used to live. And He's having to give them rules to say, don't do what you used to do.
And for all those out there that think that that's far removed from us, that's not true. It sounds too like he had a little bit of insight to modern day porn. Right? Modern day porn. So although you might not be participating in it, are you watching it? Are you watching it? Are you involved in modern day porn? To where they're glorifying the things that these cultures were doing? Because that modern day porn, man, I was addicted to porn in college. I know what modern day porn is. Well, I can't imagine what it is now. But even when I was in college, a lot of the things he said, some of the highest hits and views were the things you were talking about. I mean, that was the things he was talking about. That was the most popular videos.
But do we think that, God had a problem with those things, but it just stopped there? As long as you...
That's the Old Testament, Dustin.
Yeah. And as long as you as long as you stopped at that point, then, you must be sexually pure, I guess. No, that's the starting point, because that's how perverse and backwards the people were. But a sanctification process is what God initiated back then, and calling Abraham out and then giving His people the commands and law. And that's God's grace and mercy that we see, that He meets us where we are. And that's how backwards these people, how fallen they were, is that not only were they doing in these things, they reveled in them. The people in the nations around them sacrificed their children. They threw their children in the fire to please their God. And so if you think it's not in the heart of humanity to do some pretty perverse and wicked things, then, you're just out of touch with who we really are. But God didn't want to stop there. He started there. And the more progress we might make, then He just, calls us to something higher. Because when Jesus came along and He said, if there is lust in your heart, then you have committed adultery.
Yeah, He kind of intensified the law.
He didn't make it easier.
He didn't push it down. He elevated it.
Loving the Lord your God with all of your being is not easier. It's the hardest thing there is to do.
And to understand this too, not to get into a law conversation, but I know because a lot of people are listening to you, and they're going, that's the Old Testament though, Dustin. The laws broke down into ceremonial law, civil law, and the moral law. What Jesus comes on the scene and does is He intensifies the moral law. Of course, the ceremonial law.
He does away with the ceremonial law.
That's right, and does away with the civil law to some degree, but that does not mean that it is not in our best interest to understand the heart of God in the civil law. Like people think just because Jesus, the civil law was time constraint to that day of moving into the land, therefore we don't need to know the civil law and we don't need to know the ceremonial law. But that totally keeps you from knowing the mind and heart of God. You will learn so much more about who God is, his heart for a people, by understanding the ceremonial and the civil law and the way he addresses his people. Like I know so much more about God in the Old Testament than the New Testament gives me about God, because he literally engages with his people in these ways. And so for you who are saying, I don't need to learn about that, I don't need to know that, you don't know the fullness of God.
It's so absurd.
It's absurd to say these things.
You cannot even know Jesus without appreciating what the ceremonial law is. Jesus didn't simply do away with it. He fulfilled it because it was meant to point to him, because it was meant to demonstrate the holiness of God and how we could not approach God on our own terms, that because of our sin, we are cast away from God's presence, and only by the shedding of blood can our sin be atoned for. But it wasn't the blood of sheep and bulls, it was our blood that was demanded. But that's not satisfactory, because we're a bunch of sinners. We're actually worse than bulls and sheep, because they're not sinners, we are. Our blood would defile anyone to be in the presence of God.
Yeah, and so you like
thus the reason we need Jesus,
right?
The perfect Lamb of God.
And so you have, like, the New Testament would not have been written without the fulfillment of the Old Testament. They would not have received him as the Messiah. The only reason they received him is because he fulfilled Genesis to Malachi. He fulfilled that. And therefore they recognized him as the one who did fulfill it, or they wouldn't have written. This might come as a surprise to you. The New Testament didn't exist in Jesus' day. They read from the Old Testament, right? So they wouldn't have even have written the New Testament if it was not for the fulfilling of the Old Testament. So to pretend as if we don't need that book anymore, I would not have received Jesus. There was a lot of people that came along professing to be a Messiah. A lot of people. But they couldn't fulfill what the Old Testament said. So they went, nah, that's not it. Let's keep moving on. We have to get this out of our head that we need to unhitch from the Old Testament. That is ludicrous. It's ludicrous to think that way. And it's why so many of us have just lost who God is, and we so have adopted the culture, and we read what Jesus is saying through the lens of the culture, because we don't know the Lord our God. We don't know who he is and how he engages with his people. And he is the same yesterday as he is today. And I promise you, the church continues on this path. He will treat us the exact same as he did Israel. Again, we would argue that he already is. But the church in America, in the West at least, he's doing some amazing things in the church in the East. But
I think he's ready and willing to do amazing things. He's doing amazing things here. People are coming to know him, but at the same time, it's so convoluted, and there certainly does need to be a restoration and a revival of his Spirit in us, his us walking in faithfulness because we have been impacted by his. And man, there's opportunity in the moment, but it's not going to come. The change, the shift is not going to come immediately. There's not like there's a couple of quick, easy steps to fix all these things. Though
we are writing a book about it. You can purchase on Amazon.
The answers are age old, and they can be straightforward. It's simply returning to many of the things we've been talking about.
Amen.
To seek God and to humbly try to follow him and communicate these things to the people around us and express all of our need for him, and to look out at the world around us and see that the cause of all these problems is us. I mean, that's humanity in general. But when God has appointed his people to be ambassadors and ministers of reconciliation, which is a message that would draw people back to God, and that our relationship with God will be restored and made right again, then, that only comes from engaging people in their sin humbly, because we too have the same issues. But there's hope in that. There's hope. There's hope for the homosexual. There's hope for the sexually immoral, the person who's caught up in porn, the person who just has any number of strong desires that they can't break free from. There's hope that God is there and will walk with us and liberate us from those things if we walk with Him. But if we reject Him and shun Him, we think we don't need Him, or we think, it's the demands. If we think that even He's demanding those things of us without being with us and being willing to help us, because it's not, none of this is to suggest that someone dealing with any kind of sin, but especially some of these that are so entrenched in your identity and your past, because, sexual sin of all types, and perhaps for some, especially the homosexual identity or some of these other identities, is because of hurt and pain and trauma and things in your own past. Because the people who you're closest to, the people appointed by God with a responsibility to show and give you love, the ones who are supposed to love you the most, your own family, your own parents, they've abused that in not knowing God. And for some people, these people claim to be Christians, and yet they were the ones that molested you in your bedroom at night. They're the ones that verbally abused you and caused so much shame and pushed you into the darkness. And that, all of those things and so many more are wrong. It's wicked. It's abhorrent to God to have treated you that way and to create this pain in your life.
And just because they carried the name of Christian does not mean they were of Christ.
No, He certainly weren't loving you like Christ in those moments, if ever. And maybe that person was really confused. Maybe they probably had their own pain and trauma in their own life. That tends to be what happens. And that's what God says will happen. But rather than us perpetuate generation after generation these same things, we're looking and hoping to be delivered from them, to be rescued, to be healed from it, so that we can truly love ourselves, to know God rightly and love ourselves with His love and love the people around us, especially our own families and children, but our neighbor, our coworker, our friends.
Yeah.
Everyone.
So in this series, we hope to help you to be able to have these conversations. You said some things right there that I really want to touch on in terms of just the conversations that God gave me the opportunity to have in the industry with people living a homosexual lifestyle, the brokenness, the pain. But we're going to save that for next week because that's going to be the first conversation that we have. How do we engage and have conversations that are filled with love and truth with our LGBTQ community? Like how do we love them well? How do we love them the way that God would love them? That's going to be
that wasn't this conversation.
No, that wasn't this conversation. Like because I want to get more specific when it comes to that. And then the following week we're going to talk about how do we love something else I'm passionate about. How do we love the divorcee? Like, I feel like so many people in the church, we've elevated marriage, and marriage should be elevated, but we've elevated marriage to such a degree that people that have entered into divorce, and they've had divorce after divorce, and maybe, they don't feel like they're worthy to come into the church anymore because they've marred what God had for marriage. So have I, right? In marriage, I've marred that. I might still be married, but I've been on the brink of divorce too. Like even the divorcee, how do we love the divorcee, right? I mean, there's so many different people that we need to be thinking about how to love and how to bring back to what God has for them, a better life. Not necessarily a prosperity life of the prosperity gospel, but a better life. Sometimes a better life, you went downhill for a long time. It's tough coming back uphill. It's tough going out and going out and having to, revisit some old relationships that you thought you could just throw away. Now you got to go back and address. All right, that's tough. But we hope that you'll journey with us, because we think this will be a fruitful conversation for our community and for elevating the glory of God. And then ultimately that elevation of God's glory in our community, pushing us out, that elevation changing us in the sins that we need to deal with in our own heart, and then that encouraging and pushing us out of the church to have conversations with other people. So we hope that you would tune in, and we'll see you next time.